On behalf of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme and the Cambridge Interfaith Research Forum, which is our network for researchers interested in matters of religion and interreligious relations at the University of Cambridge, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar, part of our World Interfaith Harmony Week programming. And we'll be hearing today from 4 different speakers, each of whom is based in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge and has something to share on a different aspect of time in religious relations. Our theme is broad. The diversity of contributions that you will hear today will draw on philosophy, will draw on religious studies, will draw from different domains of religion and of academia. So I hope you'll be able to stick with us and hear the mix of different contributions. In terms of our running order, we will be hearing, first of all, from Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst, who is now in the Faculty of Divinity teaching in relation to the science and religion, so very interdisciplinary science and theology. And then we will hear from Ahmed and from Wilkinson, both of whom have been working on different dimensions of Islam and time. Imad is a PhD student in the Faculty of Divinity, working specifically on lunar matters, which I know he will talk about. Luke is also a PhD student in the University of Cambridge in the Faculty of Divinity. He has begun his PhD this year and will actually be talking about work he did when he was a master's student. And then our 4th speaker will be Dr. Ankur Barua. Ankur is the senior lecturer in Hindu studies at the University of Cambridge, although I know that his area of work and his intellectual engagement is much broader than that. And I'm delighted that we've got such an interdisciplinary panel on this topic. I should have said, I'm Dr. Iona Hine, the Programme Manager of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme based in the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge, and you'll hear a little bit more from me at the end. We hope to conclude with some time for questions and answers, but in the meanwhile, please do keep your microphone on mute if it's not your turn to speak. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Emily and invite her to put her slides up.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming. As you all have just heard, we've got a real mixture of talks today. So mine's going to be a bit more on the abstract and technical side. So I'm an academic philosopher and I'm interested in the relations between religion and science. So I'm going to be speaking from that perspective today. So today what I want to do is talk to you about a book that I've just published, and that there is, and also here it is, published last week, called Salvation in the Block Universe. And in the book, what I'm trying to do is examine the contemporary physics and metaphysics of time, and then apply those findings or those insights from time to a particular doctrine from Christianity, specifically the doctrine of salvation. So before I get into it, I want to just say a little bit about my motivations. Why study time? I think that time is completely inescapable as a feature of our lives. It frames our understanding of continuous personal identity. It structures our hopes for the future and our memories of the past. And it's the metric by which we plan our lives. So I think it's fair to say that human beings encounter the world in an inescapably temporal way. It's just not really possible to imagine a human life, psychological existence, that doesn't occur within the bounds and the boundary of time. So despite the fact that it's a really fundamental part of human experience, there's actually quite a lot of disagreement about fundamental questions like, is time real? Does time really pass? And can we trust what our experience tells us about time? So in the dialogue between science and religion that I work in, our focus on time has largely been on whether God should be thought of as inside time or outside of time. And I think that's an important issue, but what I'm really interested in is going beyond that and looking what the physics and metaphysics of time should tell us about the doctrine of salvation. So that's a bit about the motivations for the book. Now, how might time and salvation connect? So my argument, put simply, is as follows. Time is fundamentally linked to change. And in the book, I argue for a particular model of time, which is the block universe, in which change seems to be maybe impossible, maybe very different to how we imagine. And so if salvation requires a change in time, then the block universe raises problems for the viability of that position. So that's the problem that I'm looking at in the book. So since the philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart published his article in 1908 entitled The Unreality of Time, philosophers of time have followed his lead in grouping descriptions of time into two categories. There was actually a third as well, but I'm not going to go into that because these are the ones that are most popular. So we have the A theory and the B theory. An A theory of time is a theory of time in which time has the following properties. There is an objective and universal present moment, which we call now, at which point potential future events become real actual events. So on this view, time is dynamic. It passes. Successive moments possess the objective properties of future, present, and then past. So I think it's fair to say that this is probably the intuitive understanding of time that most of us have. Time passes, there is such a thing as now. And the B theory of time is also called the block universe. And this is the opposing view. So instead of time being dynamic, it's static. It doesn't flow or pass. There's no distinction, objective distinction between the past, present, and future. And there is no absolute present moment that we call now. Now, like here, is simply a matter perspective. So how might we choose between which of these theories is right? I think the best way is to look at the world and see what the world actually tells us. And the best way to do that is physics. So physics uses empirical observations to learn about time. And we can then use these observations to see whether the evidence seems to sit in favor of the A theory or the B theory. And today I want to focus very briefly on Einstein's special theory of relativity, because I think that's the best place to look. So Albert Einstein first published special relativity in 1905. And since then, the theory has been developed and rigorously tested and has stood up to scrutiny. So I obviously don't have time to discuss the whole theory today, but I want to talk about a specific finding, which is the relativity of simultaneity. So to put it briefly, special relativity seems to reveal that there is no such thing as objective simultaneity. What this means is that whether two events happen at the same time depends on what frame of reference you're observing them from. So different observers from different perspectives will disagree about whether two events are simultaneous. And importantly, there is no objective observer-independent way to say who's right. Seems like simultaneity is relative rather than objective. And the mathematician Kurt Gödel put it this way, quote, "The instance of an objective lapse of time means that reality consists of an infinity of layers of now which come into existence successively. But if simultaneity is something relative, reality cannot be split up into such layers in an objectively determined way. Each observer has his own set of nows, and none of the various layers can claim the prerogative of representing an objective lapse of time." End quote. So Gödel draws out the problem that this finding brings for an A theory of time. The A theory depends on things possessing the objectively tense properties of present, past, and future, and on time really passing. But if the relativity of simultaneity is true, then it doesn't seem like we can have some objective present moment we call now, because there is no universal simultaneity. And therefore, we can't have an objective distinction between past and future, because now is the place that draws that distinction. So this seems to be evidence in favor of the block universe, because the block universe denies that there is some objective now. So let's say special relativity supports the block universe or B theory of time. There's a huge debate to be had, but that's the position I take in the book. And I think that the block universe is inhospitable to change. Why? Because change seems to require the passage of time. As one moment passes to the next, things change their properties. But if all moments always exist, then all the various stages for all entities exist, because there's no way to say which instantiation is now. It's hard to say whether I've changed from being 28 to 29 if both 28-year-old me and 29-year-old me exist out there in the block universe. All my life stages are equally real. So what's the relevance for salvation? It seems like salvation requires a transformation, a change in time from a state of fallenness to a state of redemption. So if the block universe can't substantiate objective change, then can it accommodate salvation? Am I trying to argue that the block universe disproves the doctrine of salvation altogether? No, I'm not trying to say that. But I do want to say that we might need to reconceptualize what the doctrine looks like. So in the book, I argue that while objective change isn't possible on the block universe. Subjective change is. So we should start thinking about salvation as a subjective and a qualitative change. And in the brief amount of time I have left, I'm just going to sketch out what I mean by this. So the idea of qualitative change was first introduced by the philosopher C.D. Broad. Qualitative change can be understood as something possessing different properties at different points in the four-dimensional extension of itself. And the best way to think about this is through the analogy of the metal poker in a fire, which I've got on the slide there. So on one end, it's really hot, it might be white, and the other end, it's dark silver and much cooler. In between these temperatures are the ranges of colours from yellow to orange to red. And it doesn't make sense to ask, what colour is the poker objectively? It's all of them at different points. If you were moving your line of sight up the poker, you might subjectively experience a change from yellow to orange to red, but that change is the product of your perception, not evidence of objective change in the object. So this is what qualitative change looks like in the block universe. The hot poker is analogous to a four-dimensional extension of a person, which possesses different properties at different points in its life. So there's no observer-independent way to say which one you possess objectively or now, because there is no now. Instead, you possess them all, and they're all equally real. So in the block universe, time doesn't pass, but we perceive things as though they are changing in time. So one explanation of this is that the mind constructs experiences of temporal passage from the static events of the block universe, like the way that you might generate a moving picture or a movie from looking at lots of images in quick succession. So agents experience change subjectively as the world changes before them, and their consciousness pieces together that change, even if no change is happening objectively in the world. So my claim is that we can think of salvation in this way, as agents experiencing qualitative change, even if their four-dimensional extension of themselves doesn't change. So they still have fallen parts and saved parts, but the experience of a salvation transformation might just be enough in this lifetime. So that's basically the argument. The problem, of course, is that if you're a Christian, you believe that salvation involves the overcoming of sin, and your sinful temporal parts still exist in the block universe. So what you really need is an eschatological claim as well about the transformation of everything at the end of the universe. But in terms of salvation happening in time, I think this is the best model that we have. So I'm gonna wrap up there in the interest of time. So I'm sorry to have rushed through a 300-page book in 10 minutes, but I hope that's given you a kind of flavour for the way that I'm discussing time in the relationship between science and religion in the book. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emily. What a wonderful taster. And I hope that's given people the appetite needed to engage with your book. Next up is Imad.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for Emily for an incredible start to this panel discussion. Today is, I think we all agree, Thursday of February, and it's, according to my phone, 2:46. I'm reasonably confident and secure that wherever you are, if you're in England, London, Cambridge, Glasgow, Scotland, but any part of these isles, you are experiencing the same timekeeping moment right now. And this isn't just the case for everybody in England. I'm reasonably secure, though I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure that if I was to phone my relative right now who's living in Bangladesh, that their time is 6 hours ahead of us, to the minute, in fact, and to the second. And this standardization of time or homogenization of time, which is not just local, but global, is something that we've all experienced from before we were born. But this wasn't necessarily the case, and it wasn't necessarily the case even here in the UK. Not so long ago in the 19th century, different cities had a different time. Bristol's time was calibrated to the noon of Bristol, and it was 10 minutes different from the time that we had in London. And that difference of time later became standardized, largely because of technology and train times and other reasons that I'm not going into here. But all of our lives, we've been very accustomed, if we're living in Gregorian time or the Gregorian calendar, to have a standardized time where we imagine everybody on planet Earth is experiencing the same time as us simultaneously. But not so the case for the Muslim community, which is what my PhD looks at. And the Muslim community, specifically in Britain, they have a lot of debates about time, timekeeping, and what date is it today. And on any given date in the Gregorian calendar, like today is the 6th of February, we might find Muslims debating whether it's the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or even the 4th of the month. Now, the Islamic calendar in other parts of the world, say, for example, where there's a Muslim government, is managed by the government, and we don't have those debates. Just like in the UK, we're not really debating whether it's Thursday or not today. It's done by an act of parliament. But in the UK, of course, there's not a Muslim government. And what my PhD looks at is, in the absence of an authority who manages time for us, what are the debates that occur? And I find it to be a very rich debate that is not occurring in the centers, if you like, of the Muslim world, but very much at the peripheries where Muslims are minorities, like here in the UK. Now, the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, and it's a central part of ritual life, meaning the Muslims use it, and it's very timely right now because on February the 28th will be the date that Muslims go out and look for the moon for Ramadan. So if they see the moon, it means they will begin and commence a whole month of fasting. And in as much as it's a religious calendar, meaning the rules of the calendar are outlined in the Quran and by the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, it's seen as a moral issue, but there may be other dimensions as to why we see it as a moral issue. And there's no consensus. In my research, I have found 13 operational positions in the UK. Theoretically, I don't know how many, much more. But this leads to annual disagreements when we start Ramadan. And there will be a disagreement this coming Ramadan at the end of the month, and Eid. And it is very emotive. Families are split. In fact, my own family is split. Some of my family will be fasting, and some of us will be feasting at the end of Eid. It doesn't feel nice, especially for the kids. Some of them are fasting and others are playing outside, or they'll play outside when they're fasting anyway. But you understand that lack of unity has been a problem. So in what I hope to present today are two things. One is an autobiographical account of how I found myself researching this. And it's not just me telling you my life story, but it impacts my research. And I hope you get a flavor of some of these debates in the UK through my own eyes. But then I'd like to outline what it is I'm finding and what is my tentative argument as to what is really behind these debates. Because actually I believe, and I have to do a bit more research, I don't believe this debate existed between before around 1930. So it's a very almost 100 years of debate, and before that, no discussion about this topic in this detail and in this way. So my own journey is, I come from a Muslim family. I come from East London, not from the mosque. But where I live, and it's the name of a road, Lea Bridge Road, near where I live, there's actually there's 3 mosques now. When I made this slide, there were 2 mosques on this road. And growing up, there was never a consensus just between these 2 mosques on the same street on what day we should celebrate Eid. And this, of course, was very divisive for the community. I remember when I was a schoolboy and the teacher would ask me, what day are you taking off for Eid? I don't know, miss. And half of us will take the day off one day and half of us will take the day off another day. And generally, I had been told growing up, it's because we don't have a Muslim government. This was one of the myths of the Islamic calendar. But quite by chance, life-changing, I went on a holiday to Cape Town in South Africa. And there, they too are a Muslim minority, but I found they don't have these debates. And in fact, they have a united Islamic calendar in Cape Town and in South Africa in general. And I saw that they had the practice of going out to sight the moon every single month within their locality. And this is just some pictures of a moon sighting. It's for Eid, and a few thousand people go down to the beach, and it's a very communal atmosphere. And this is not something that had been occurring in the UK. There was no moon sighting really in the UK occurring. And to that end, when I returned to the UK, I was inspired to found an amateur astronomy organization called New Crescent Society, with the explicit aim for solving the UK Islamic calendar debates. Part of that journey has led me to work with the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. I've been going around the country, it's way before my PhD, training people in how to sight the moon. And we've established moon sighting locations around the country. And these are just some of the pictures to give you a flavor of the types of people looking for the moon for their own timekeeping purposes. And in 2019, I held a conference at the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, symbolically the home of time or the home of Greenwich Mean Time, to discuss with about 130 mosques how should we properly construct our calendar in the UK, which has led me to this PhD. And the question I'm trying to answer for my PhD is, why do Muslims differ about the Islamic calendar? And what might this tell us about the lived experience of Muslims in the UK? Now, I'm telling you all this because it means I'm not a neutral researcher. I was deep in this game before I wrote my, maybe it was block time and there was no past or present. But at the time of applying for my PhD, I was already I'm not famous, but I do get recognized sometimes. And so when people come up to me and when I'm researching, they don't approach me as an academic researcher from Cambridge University. They approach me as a well-known person in this topic who's been on the media on this topic. And actually, I'm spoken to, in a way, lobbied. I'm spoken to and directly told by people, your PhD should say this. What you are saying should say this. And I had this really incredible experience. I think it was last term. A very elderly gentleman, like in his 80s, from Trinidad, was visiting the UK. He's an Islamic scholar. And he came to Cambridge to meet me. And I said to him, would you like to go? I'll show you Queen's College or the Divinity faculty. He said, no, I'm just here to see you. Let's have a cup of tea. And there he sat me down and he said, your PhD should say, and so this to reveal some of the stakes of this debate, that Muslims have abandoned their sacred time, which is connected to nature, and they have gone into mechanical, secular, godless time of the Antichrist. And he was lobbying me to say this. Now, I felt it's profound. He's an elderly gentleman. It's one of maybe his last messages he wants to share with the world. But it also occurred to me that these debates aren't occurring inside the university. He didn't want to go to Queen's College. These debates occur online. They occur in pamphlets. They occur in debates outside the mosque or in coffee shops on Mill Road. This debate is not occurring in the ivory towers. That's like how I've got into it. And I'd like to share with you a bit more about the debate. Now, the calendar is a lunar calendar, and it's founded by the Prophet Muhammad. In some speeches I've listened to, Muslims take some amount of pride in this. They say our calendar is founded by the founder of our religion. The Christian calendar is not founded by Christ. The Buddhist calendar is not founded by Buddha. So there is a sense of pride about the calendar. And it's a lunar calendar. You go out and sight the moon to begin the month. But it's always been a local calendar. And what I mean by this, and of course it's very different to the Gregorian calendar, which is global, is that every locality naturally sees the moon on a different date. This is a lunar visibility map. Green there means the moon is visible on that given date. And if it's not green, it means it's not visible. This would mean on this particular date, Brazil might start the month if they see the moon, but Australia or the UK or India wouldn't. And it's perfectly natural, normal, and scientific for different parts of the world to start the month on different dates. But as we've moved into the modern world, a new set of questions have emerged. And these are some of the things underlying the debates in the UK. And one is very much driven by technology. Now we have instantaneous communication. Must we rely on a localized calendar? Could it be a global calendar like the Gregorian calendar? And this is actually quite confusing for Muslims who might be watching a live stream of a holy ritual in Mecca, and they have rituals associated at home corresponding to what the pilgrims are doing. So they have a question arising. How can it be a holy day in Mecca, but not holy here? How can the angels be descending on one part of the earth, but not on my part of the earth? And this kind of idea of a standardized time is something that now has, what I call in my PhD, shifted the common sense of Muslims about the nature of time. And other broader questions, do we need to look for the moon? We've got all these data, we've got apps now, can't we just use an app instead? Other questions around technology, can we use telescopes, binoculars, astrocam? What is local? Is a nation state local? Which is a question many of the politically minded Muslims ask, because they say the nation state is that tool of the colonizer that was there to divide us. And how can we affirm the nation state in our calendar? So these are some of the stakes of the debate. Now, parts of the Muslim community frame this debate as solely a scriptural debate, which is to be had amongst the priestly class or the ulama class. My interpretation of the Quran says this, and my interpretation of the Quran says that. And from the outset, my PhD will be arguing that to say it's a scriptural debate solely is inadequate, because partly because it removes agency from those other people who have a different perspective, like astronomers or people in academia like myself. But actually, there are other things occurring. I had this thing I was going to read out, like a part of my ethnography. I don't have time. But if I was going to read out my ethnography, I had an account of an imam who disagreed with the Islamic calendar date of his committee, because the committee were following Saudi Arabia. And he had looked up scientific data on his phone, and he said that the data was wrong and Saudi had faked the moon sighting. And he announced that at the mosque, and he was actually sacked that day. And what I wanted to highlight there, this is not a hermeneutical scriptural debate. It's a debate involving politics, political intrigue. It's sometimes internal mosque dynamics, that the member of clergy, if you like, the alim or the imam, had a position, but his congregation or the committee members who are non-scholarly class can overrule him. So there are far more complications going on. And if we're seeking to find a way forward through these debates, we can't just keep it on the terms of scripture. And so my tentative thesis statement is as follows. So despite all parties referencing Islamic scripture, these debates extend beyond scriptural hermeneutics to encompass issues such as politics, migration patterns, technology, globalization's impact on our perception of time, and tensions between sacred geography and the nation state. And ultimately, I'll be arguing that this debate can be best understood as an iteration of wider debates around how Muslims orient themselves towards modernity in general and post-colonial authority in particular. And what I mean by post-colonial authority, maybe if somebody would like to ask me in the Q&A, we can discuss that. But I hope you've just got a flavor of some of the debates around time in the Muslim community. Now, the last thing I want to say, to hand over to my friend and colleague Luke, one thing that Muslims do speak to me about is they say, what is the spiritual significance or the philosophical significance of looking for the moon every month? Is there something to it? And they ask me to mine into Islamic philosophy or spiritual writing to give that to them. And I would say I am very deficient in this, but Luke is about to present on these topics to answer this question. What can those people engaging in moon sighting or debates around the Islamic calendar learn from the particular philosophical figure of Allama Iqbal, who was a modern Muslim philosopher from Pakistan, about modernity, time, and nature? So with that, I hope to hand over to Luke. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Imad, for introducing me slightly there. And I don't think I can answer such large questions that I've been introduced with, but I will try. We've just seen in the presentation by Imad how moon sighting has always been the foundation of Islamic timekeeping, but in the modern age has become increasingly challenged and destabilized. And people are asking these questions about the significance of it. For me, this elicits two central questions. One, can we identify a metaphysics of time in Islam? And two, how might this offer a mode of Muslim selfhood in modernity? In the following 10 minutes or so, I'll explore these two questions through the thought of Muhammad Iqbal. So who was Iqbal? Iqbal was born in the Punjab in 1877 to a devout Muslim family. He was educated in the traditional madrasa and a British-founded missionary school before studying at Lahore Government College in India, and then at Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, where you can still actually visit an unofficial plaque in his honor on Portugal Place here. He studied here in Cambridge between 1905 to 1907, and in fact, his director of studies we've already heard about from Emily, who was McTaggart, J.M.E. McTaggart, who in fact prompted him to think deeply about the relationship of a metaphysics of time and God. After this, he returned to India after a brief stop in Germany, becoming a famous poet before delivering a series of lectures to Muslim students that were later compiled and published as The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam in 1934. He would die in 1938, 9 years before the creation of Pakistan, which would claim him as their spiritual pater patriae, which he might have well contested. Here I will be focusing on his work, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, this series of 7 lectures that he delivered, which has established Iqbal as a leading Islamic philosopher of the 20th century, both in the Muslim world, so obviously in Pakistan. His thoughts very influential in the Iranian Revolution, though again, perhaps in a way he wouldn't have liked. And then also in the Western world, he's a well-known figure. Within his own lifetime, he was well-known in the Western world. So before diving into how Iqbal approached modernity, let us briefly expand upon what Imad has suggested in relation to the modern conception of time. So the German intellectual historian Reinhard Koselleck, who lived between 1923 and 2006, showed historically that time has not been understood in the same way throughout history. Importantly, he argued that the French Revolution of 1789 drastically altered the conception of time in Europe. To oversimplify his argument, pre-modern Christian Europe had conceived of the future as contained within the past, and thus ultimately familiar, while the French Revolution demonstrated that the future was now an open-ended possibility and a radical unknown. The expansion of industry and technology that coincided with and followed the French Revolution added an additional element to this matrix. While previously the time that had been kept in Christian Europe by the ringing of the church bell, the technological development in timekeeping devices meant that as the 19th century wore on, it was possible to record minutes and even seconds, the portable wristwatch becoming common at the turn of the 20th century, with which every man was now in conformity to the ticking of the second hand. As Priya Satia has shown, this new emphasis upon timekeeping was brought into colonial administration, with the forceful division of colonial India into different time zones to enable efficient administration. The whole world would eventually be brought forcefully under the hegemony of the second hand. Time it appeared, had become subject to man, and specifically the white man. But time now constrained, in turn subjugated mankind. With the relentless ticking of the second hand, man breathlessly tried to keep up with the present. This made time a purely immanent phenomenon. Man looked hurriedly down at his wrist, not up at the moon. How does Iqbal intervene here? Iqbal delivered the lectures in The Reconstruction of Religious Thought, ultimately to demonstrate an ontological map for Muslims to navigate the cosmology of modernity. Principally, this would involve how people of faith might interact with modern science and philosophy, which we've seen a little bit in Emily already. We have seen how time became both a victim and then the executioner of modernity, from my previous paragraph. Once time was reduced to the intervals of a watch face and enlightened the discoveries of Einstein, which partially conceived of time as a dimension of space. I'm not an expert in this regard, but that's what Iqbal believed. Iqbal worries that the contemporary philosophy had begun to spatialize time. The psychiatrist and philosopher, more recently, Ian McGilchrist, argues that the fact that we see time as a thing that we can measure on a watch indicates the power of the modern aptitude to isolate the world into discrete things. In such a context, we treat the divine itself as a thing and find him or it missing. And Iqbal quotes the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, "Do not vilify time, for time is God." Drawing upon his education at Cambridge, which led him to the philosophy of Henri Bergson, a famous French philosopher, who in fact debated Einstein on time at the League of Nations, Iqbal seeks to free time from space by differentiating two forms of time, serial time and real time. Serial time is a succession of discrete moments, which had become concretized in the modern world by the activity of the second hand. We can simply think of it as the ticking of the second hand, where each second is discrete to itself and contained within itself. Real time is time as one indivisible flow, which we might accidentally or intentionally enter when we feel time as one single movement, which Iqbal believed McTaggart had identified, but wrongly identified as a sort of false sense of time, or which led him to his argument that time wasn't real because he believed he was approaching time from this perspective of serial time, where it's discrete moments, but he actually experienced this real time, this singular flow, and therefore believed there was no actual real thing called time because it was just this block, continuous thing. But in fact, Iqbal says, no, this actually is a form of time, and it's called real time, where we can feel the constant creativity of the divine, and we can feel the singular flow. Now, Iqbal highlights that these two forms of time are in fact at play in the Quran. And this is symbolized in these two quotes from the Quran, which I do just want to show you so you get a sense of what they are. So he says that both these forms of time exist in the Quran, which is really important. He says that, and this is represented in these two phrases from the Quran. One, God in 6 days created the heaven and the earth. And two, our command was but one, swift as the twinkling of an eye. Now, those two quotes are really important because Iqbal uses them to show that the same act of creation could be perceived in discrete moments from the perspective of serial time, of discrete moments, but also as one stretched out now. It was in creation that happened in 6 days, but also in the blink of an eye. It was in a singular now, but also could be divided into 6 days. Now, we might also see Iqbal's interpretation of the Quran as pointing to how serial time and real time map onto the immanence and transcendence of God. In the first verse, creation is immanent, for you can mark out the discrete succession of changes in the creative act, as in the history of evolution. We can mark this creation out into 6 different days, which is a form of serial time. In the second verse, creation is transcendent, a singularity that cannot be divided. At the same time, in the first verse about the 6 days, this immanence emanates from the transcendent, because our division of days does not encapsulate the timescale of the Creator, who operates. These days are not human days. So our perception of serial time is not the same as the Creator's. While in the second verse, the immanence of the transcendent that we directly feel is so all-pervasive that we are actually incapable of differentiating it into serial time. We are so overwhelmed by creation that it can only be felt as one singular flow. By demonstrating that there is a different form of time, real time, beyond the ticking hand that anchors the modern conception and practice of time, Iqbal points to the need to connect to a deeper form of time. Importantly, though, by demonstrating both forms of time are present in the Quran, Iqbal is suggesting that we should not, as Bergson and many mystics do, disregard serial time or perhaps even McTaggart dismiss time as unreal completely. Immanence and transcendence swirl over one another. The immanence in serial time and the transcendence that one can perhaps feel in real time are constantly interacting with one another. What is the relationship between these two forms of time with the mode in which you observe the world around us? Iqbal stressed that the Quran was fundamentally anti-classical in spirit. It had departed with the locating truth in the Platonic world of the forms. Muhammad, it is interesting, in fact, located truth in the cave. He was told to read Iqra, upon which he recited the first verses of the Quran while meditating in a cave, which is in quite distinct contrast to Plato, where truth cannot be located in the cave. Building from this, the Quran repeatedly calls on us to draw our attention to this world, the natural world, and see God's signs in it. As Iqbal reminds us, a wider attentiveness to nature in the Quran is attending to time. Listening to the Quran, we are repeatedly urged to reflect on the movement of the sun and the moon as crucial signs of God. By observing the moon, we become aware both of serial time, the discrete changes in the moon's appearance each night, but we also have to sink into a deeper awareness of the ceaseless flow of time, the moon's changes not being observable by the eye moment by moment. There is a balance, or mizan, in Islamic terminology, here between the serial and real, between immanent and transcendent. So Muslims can find in Muhammad Iqbal's conception of time a mode of keeping time with modernity, without losing a deeper form of time to connect to the transcendent, that modernity has in fact lost. The practice of telling the time by the moon encourages an empirical focus upon the natural world, which Iqbal argues ultimately stems and began with the Quran. Iqbal urges Muslims to use a wider range of their faculties to observe the world, and therefore we might add tell the time by the moon than modern science allows. Here Iqbal draws together Sufism and psychology. According to the Sufi understanding of human knowledge, we possess two key faculties of perception, stemming from the nafs, psyche, and qalb, heart, which interact with the ruh, which is the spirit of the divine that lies within each one of us. For Iqbal, while nafs, or the psyche, relates to the intellect, qalb is a kind of inner intuition that brings us into contact with aspects of reality other than those open to sense perception. So the qalb is actually a form of directly perceiving the world, but it connects to a different layer of that reality. In observing the moon, Muslims must use both faculties. Observing the moon with their intellect, they're able to tell the time from nature, not their watch, which points them to a deeper creative flow of time. Not only does this bring them to see the constant creation of the transcendent in the immanent, in nature, but also the immanent nature of the transcendent. Gazing at the moon from their qalb, they might be reminded of the Sufi poetry that addresses the moon as symbolic of the Prophet, peace be upon him, who reflects the singular light of the divine. In a modernity defined by an exclusive immanency, Muslims might be reminded by the moon of the transcendent in the immanent in the Prophet. To truly tell the time in modernity, Muslim moonsighters might then turn to the lectures of Iqbal. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lou. And last, we have Ankur Barua, who will further meditate on our topic of time.
Hello, everyone. Before we run out of time, I would like to share with you in around 12 minutes some of my reflections on the relation between time and religion. For many decades now, I have been reflecting on the question of time in an inter-religious context, more specifically in a context of Hindu, Christian, and Muslim understandings of salvation or liberation. In a precise form, this is the question: how much time do you need to be saved? Let me repeat, how much time do you need to be saved? My PhD, written between 2001 and 2005, grappled with this question with respect to the religious cosmologies of the 5th century Christian theologian St. Augustine and the 11th century Hindu theologian Ramanuja. Christian and Muslim worldviews operate with a single lifetime vision. We have only one world-bound life, namely this present life, within which we have to find, gain, or receive salvation. And I use that slightly long-winded formulation, namely find, gain, or receive, to sidestep debates over the relation between human free will and divine grace. In contrast, Hindu and Buddhist worldviews operate with a multiple lifetime vision. Some of us may find, gain, or receive the ultimate good in this present world-bound life. Those of us who do not will return to another world-bound life where the spiritual project can be resumed. The reason why this topic was of such deep interest to me when I was around 18 years old, that I spent 4 long years exploring it for the PhD, is related to my childhood upbringing in a northeastern part of India called Assam, in a multi-religious environment of Hindu family members with Christian relatives and Muslim friends. When I was in my early teens, my mother died a slow, lingering death. Thereafter, I sometimes lived with a devoutly Roman Catholic aunt. In those years, I became deeply involved with, I would even say tormented by, afflicted by this question: what happens to those individuals who, for whatever reason, are not able to respond in faith to the Christian gospel? Billions of human beings have passed away and are passing away even right now as we are speaking in the state of unfaith vis-a-vis the gospel. Of them, some of them have lived for only a few days or weeks and have died in their infancy. Others may have been lucky, fortunate to live for a few decades, but have been so involved in back-breaking labor that they have had no time to turn their minds and hearts to spiritual matters. In medieval Europe, mothers would often run to the local church to have their babies baptized, driven by the terrifying thought that unbaptized babies go to limbo, that is a state of incomplete happiness. We academics are somewhat lucky with respect to time. We are paid a monthly salary to minutely investigate topics relating to God, the world, and the human self. And yet, with respect to the momentous question of salvation, who knows, even if we scholars are spending our time truthfully, fruitfully, meaningfully, or are headed towards limbo or worse, perdition. As you can see, the question, will all such individuals ever have time to gain, find, or receive salvation is deeply intertwined with what philosophers and theologians call the problem of evil. If some of us, or perhaps many of us, will run out of time on our pilgrimage towards salvation, then this existential failure only seems to magnify the problem of evil. It may seem that our world is riddled with a type of cosmic injustice where only a handful are lucky enough, fortunate enough to find the time, the leisure to consciously turn towards the ultimate reality. As I said, these questions deeply troubled me when I was a PhD student. For better or worse, their existential urgency has become somewhat diluted as I grow older. In those days, I was a restless mountain stream flying in different disconnected directions. Today, I'm a jaded river that is ready to meet the vast sea of unknowing. Yet the question of whether or not one lifetime is sufficient for the grand project of salvation or liberation continues to pester me and now reappears in my historical fiction. In my first novel, The Harvest of Time, an English doctor based in Cambridge says this to Nilufar, a Muslim woman. This is how I like to think of the mind. It is a huge cavern with numerous corridors branching out at every turn. We only take some of these roads. One life is never enough time to try out all of them. The ones we do not take sometimes cry out to us, pleading with us to return to them. And the ones we do walk into, they leave behind traces, some too painful to remember. On this occasion, I will not even begin to address what we may call the metaphysical question of which understanding of temporality is correct, the linear understanding of time as a straight line extending from creation to the day of judgment or resurrection, or the cyclical understanding of time as proceeding through spirals towards the ultimate good, moksha, nirvana. Let me add that cyclical does not mean that the next world order will be exactly identical to the present world order. Those individuals who have become liberated in this lifetime, that is, attained moksha or nirvana, will not return to the next. Again, Hindu and Buddhist texts repeatedly emphasize that a human rebirth is extremely rare in the vast cosmological cycles, and so one should not fritter it away by remaining immersed in worldliness. So the cyclical understanding of temporality incorporates a linear aspect of the arrow of time. Now, notwithstanding the presence of certain straightforward divergences across these understandings, I will highlight in the next, 3 or 4 minutes, one shared pattern in the understanding of the relation between temporality and salvation across Hindu, Muslim, and Christian religious worldviews. So here is a question for us today. Is God a stern schoolmaster, or is God a long-suffering companion? With respect to this question, there are two types each of Hindus, Christians, and Muslims. According to the first type, God is a stern schoolmaster who sets a test for you by saying, here is the truth, and following the truth means ticking these boxes on the right and not ticking those boxes on the left. Go on then, let's see how you do it. Perhaps you will succeed in this enterprise and you will be crowned with glory by God. Perhaps you will fail and all kinds of unspeakable things I will not speak of here will happen to you. This does not mean that God is some remote observer standing 20 million miles away from you. God does help you in many ways. God gives you instruction, God gives you wisdom, God shows you the correct path. But the focus otherwise is on you. If you get it wrong, don't be a crybaby. That is because God does not cry. God shines with the imperial grandeur of the sun, which illuminates everyone equally. According to the second type, God is a long-suffering companion. Once again, God says, here is the truth, and following the truth means ticking these boxes on the right and not ticking those boxes on the left. Go on then, let's see how you do it. However, this time, let's see how you do it, is to be read in the following way. I, God, know you, my devotee, are going to make a mess of it. But I'm always here to clean up after you. In the end, it does not greatly matter who is serving whom. I, God, serving you, or you, my servant, serving me. What is true is that when you suffer, I, God, suffer even more than you yourself do. But my suffering is not a form of weakness. It is, in fact, the true strength. Now, in a Christian or a Muslim context, according to the first type, the timeless God who is atemporal will give us limited time, that is to say, the present lifetime, with respect to our salvation. The second type may allow certain variations on the standard doctrinal answer. Perhaps after death, we will enter into an intermediate state of purgatory. Perhaps we can yet throw ourselves at the feet of the divine judge and beseech the supreme reality to be compassionate unto us one more time. Perhaps in some way that our human intellect cannot quite comprehend, God's mercy and God's justice are mystically blended, such that those human beings who have not had enough time will be granted more time. And I highlight perhaps, because these are, of course, speculative hypotheses, my own. In short, to conclude, the question of being and the question of time are deeply interconnected across Hindu, Christian, and Muslim theological landscape. Will the divine being remain patient, possibly until the very end of time, with our numerous human failings? Or has the divine being declared that there is a cosmological cutoff point of no return? In my middle age, I suddenly realized that I have spent, some would say wasted, 3 decades of my life in contemplation on such grand questions about the nature of time. So that is all from me.
Thank you so much. It is an irony that is quite obvious to me that part of my responsibility in this session is to act as timekeeper. And I'm very mindful that the conversation on this topic could easily unwind not over many minutes and hours, but indeed decades, to which Ankur has alluded. If you were paying attention, you might notice that we advertise this as a 60-minute webinar, which we shall respect by closing our formal element at the 60-minute mark. However, the calendar invitation in the Zoom session will remain open for a further 15 minutes to honour a little the informality and to do our best to be, on the one hand, a respecter of those appointments that you might have and you might need to leave, while resisting the relentless hegemony of time, to borrow a phrase. So I open the floor to a question which we can take within our time, and perhaps that might be one for Emily, who I know might need to leave earlier than others. So we've got Hine is presenting questions in the comments. Hine, would you like me to read your question? It's very much a message of appreciation at the start, but I think to the panelists, would it be possible to speak to the beauty of the temporal condition, the gifts, benefits, and virtues of being in time?
I'm happy to speak to that if you can go first. So, yeah, I think the passage of time as we experience it seems to be a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm approaching a big birthday. I'm about to turn 30 and I'm feeling the relentless passage of time quite acutely at the moment. But I think we can easily see it as something negative. It's part of the human condition to fear death, to fear our time running out. But to speak to the beauty of time a bit, I think one of the things that's really comforting about the passage of time, even in the midst of extreme suffering, the worst moments of our lives, we know that they will pass. So the passage of time is scary in some ways, but I think it can also be very liberating in others, that whatever condition we're in, it feels transitory and we will be able to escape it. It will pass, time will move on. So I think it's very brief reflection, but that's when you talk about the beauty of being temporal beings, that's one of the things I think as well. And also maybe one other thing is the joy and the beauty of relationships that you build over time as well. So we are lucky to be able to connect with people and then experience those connections deepen and enrich over time. And seeing your childhood friend change from a child into an adult who's like maybe raising children, that's a really beautiful thing to witness as well. So I think that's another thing I would say is a real benefit to being a being in time.
Thank you so much. So that was Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst speaking as we meet the 1 hour mark. And to appropriately close off our session, I would just like to advertise the symposium taking place tomorrow in Cambridge for those that are able to be geographically in the same place at the same time. Tomorrow afternoon in Cambridge, there will be a kind of continuity thinking about the complexity, in this case, of tradition and modernity through interreligious encounters in different settings. So I'd like to thank Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst, Imad Ahmed, Luke Wilkinson, and Dr. Ankur Barua for their contributions today. And for those who are able to stay online with us, we will continue the conversation, but I will stop the recording here.